good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are tuning in with us. We're very grateful to have you here and excited to welcome you to our 6th WAP seminar of this calendar year, this spring semester. At WAP, our mission is to equip leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity in work and politics. I'm Hannah Riley Bowles. I am the co-faculty director of the Women and Public Policy program. And this semester, our gender and public policy seminar, our research seminar, is focused on gender and politics. And we have just an amazing slate of 12 speakers. We're at our midpoint and at a high point in our series, because today we have Professor Lena Krook, who's someone who's a longtime friend of the Women in Public Policy program, someone whose work we've tracked for a long time, as she was originally a fellow, and whose work we've just long admired. Professor Krook is a professor of political science and chair of the Women in Politics Ph.D. program at Rutgers University, which is known for actually famous for the strength of its programming and research in relation to women in politics. Professor Krook has published widely on gender and political representation, particularly gender quotas and the impact of women in public office. Her work has appeared in numerous academic journals, including the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, and the Journal of Politics. Her first book, Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, won 2 major book awards from the American Political Science Association. Her most recent book, Violence Against Women in Politics, develops this concept, illustrates what it looks like in practice, and catalogs emerging solutions around the globe. So Professor Krook is actually a scholar who bridges our fall theme of looking at gender and conflict and violence with our spring theme now of looking at gender and politics. Since 2015, she's collaborated with the National Democratic Institute on its hashtag Not the Cause campaign, and more recently launched a website to gather resources and foster greater awareness of violence against women in politics worldwide. We are pleased to welcome WAP's podcast community, as well as all of those who are tuning in real time today. Our podcast community has downloaded our seminars over 59,000 times, and we are so pleased to have this lasting and broad-reaching impact beyond those who are able to attend the seminar within our seminar room, be that a Zoom room or a classroom. We're really excited to be welcoming people to both spaces before too long. Our speaker will present for 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions from our virtual audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. Those who do have a question will have the opportunity to be unmuted to ask the question out loud. We do ask that any audience questions be brief, on topic, and posed in the form of a question and be relevant to the presenter's research. My colleague, Katie Omberg, will, as in her inimitably skillful way, manage the Q&A portion of the seminar after Professor Krook has finished speaking. So please join me in welcoming Professor Krook today.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen, just pull up my presentation. Okay, you can see it. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share my research on violence against women in politics. So this is the cover of my new book on this topic, which is published by an academic press, but it's very much inspired by work that I've been doing with practitioners over the last 5 or 6 years. It's really written also for practitioners as well as for academics. So violence against women in politics is a relatively new concept in global debates on gender and politics. So my book really starts with the question of, where did this concept of violence against women in politics come from? How are we starting to talk about it? Who first started to articulate it? And then I address sort of the second part of my book, how it's different from other forms of violence in politics. People often talk about politics as a space of conflict, and we think about violence in elections, but how is this different from those existing ideas? Thirdly, what does it look like around the world? And finally, what can be done to address it, and why does it matter that we do? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of the book by giving you a sense of some of my answers to those 4 questions. Okay, so if we start with the question about where did this idea come from, I had very interesting experience trying to sort of think back, explore how people started to talk about this issue. So I did a lot of interviews with practitioners. I did research, in-person research, in a number of parts of the world, participated in many workshops on this topic. And really found that violence against women in politics, like many women's experiences of the world, was until recently a problem with no name. We're going to Betty Friedan's idea of the problem with no name. So what we really see happening over the last 20 years or so is women trying to give a name to this experience. So really at this sort of starting with their own lives in very sort of grassroots way. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a network of locally elected women in Bolivia who started to share their experiences of what they called political harassment and violence against women. In the mid-2000s, there was a series of workshops organized amongst elected women in various South Asian countries who started to talk about violence against women in politics. And then in the late 2000s in Kenya, in the wake of a very contested election in 2007, people started to talk about electoral gender-based violence. So they gave slightly different names to this problem, but really tried to capture this similar idea of a form of violence, form of harassment, intimidation that women were facing in politics because they were women, right? And it was really directed at deterring their political participation. About 10 years ago, different international practitioners started to link these types of debates, right, which were emerging in parallel different parts of the world. It was really people who were working on sort of the space of electoral assistance, women's political participation. And at the time, just like me, they were interested in things like gender quotas, getting more women elected, nominated to candidates around the world. And they found that really just those types of mechanisms really weren't eroding all of the resistance to women's participation. The women on the ground were experiencing this sort of resistance and backlash to their entry into politics. And so you start to see them connect these debates, increasingly call it violence against women in politics. But in the early days, it was really still seen as an issue affecting the global South. Over the last, say, 5 to 8 years, a growing number of women across the global North have started to speak out about this issue as well. So you might remember 2012, Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard's famous misogyny speech on the floor of the Australian Parliament. But we also see politicians in France, in Italy. 2016, we have the murder of British parliamentarian Jo Cox, the 2016 elections in the United States, and the 2017 global Me Too movement, which really also thought about the issue of sexual violence in political spaces. So what's really been the result of these developments is to highlight the fact that, like violence against women, which is a global problem affecting women in all social groups, all ages, all backgrounds, violence against women in politics is also a global problem. It affects women in all parts of the world. As a result of this awareness, we're seeing increasing institutionalization of this idea in different global frameworks. Here's just one example of the UN General Assembly resolution from 2018, which was the first to focus on the issue of sexual harassment And that resolution expressed deep concerns about all acts of violence, including sexual harassment against women and girls involved in political and public life. If you're following next week's UN Commission on the Status of Women meetings, this is also one of the themes of the CSW meetings this year, which is focusing on women in public life, equal participation, including ending violence against women. So if you look at the sessions, both the official sessions, the side events, the civil society side events, lots and lots of discussion of violence against women in politics. So this is really, I think, we're at a key turning point of talking about this issue globally. Okay, so sort of stepping back and thinking about what this issue is and how it's different from other forms of violence in politics. I think it's really important just to clarify maybe at this moment what I mean by the term violence. So as a political scientist, and I think more broadly, sort of the everyday usage of the word violence thinks about it as physical violence, thinking about acts of physical force. But that's one, say, more minimalistic way of thinking about violence. The approach I adopt in this book is very much more in line with feminist conceptions, which are more comprehensive in thinking about what violence is. And I found the work of Victorio Bufacchi very helpful. He says we should think about violence or define it as a violation of a person's integrity in the sense of the wholeness or intactness of the self. So you can be attacked, your physical integrity could be intact, but also your sort of mental and emotional integrity as well. And so in his work, he says, the reason why violence is bad is it's not just this sort of physical injury, it's also the social meaning of being harmed. If we think about, feminist ideas of violence, I think it's very consistent with this idea that there might be some very dramatic, visible, very obvious forms of violence, right? But they're kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? The top of the pyramid, there are a whole bunch of other acts that are sort of part of a continuum of violence. And it's not just that they, exist in these varied forms, but these are forms that interact and support one another. So it's as important to think about those more hidden, especially more normalized forms of violence, thinking about how they sort of collectively form part of the problem of violence against women in politics. Okay, so then how is this different from other forms of violence in political spaces? Well, political scientists and also electoral practitioners around the world have really thought about political violence as a problem that is issue-based. So people attack their political opponents, people on the opposing side. So this is a form of violence that could affect both men and women, right? Candidates, but also voters, right? Of the other side, thinking about voter suppression, right? This would be an example of political violence. It tends to be higher in places where violence is more normalized or there's more impunity. So for example, in a post-conflict situation or a place where there's lots of, criminal violence that's not held accountable. And this is a form of violence that can take some gender differentiated forms. In Zimbabwe, for example, they talk about politically motivated rape, where women who support the opposing political party are targeted for sexual violence. But the idea is really, it's still issue based, right? It's still a policy difference or party based. So this is a form of violence that, because it's about trying to win political debates or contest through force and intimidation, it's a form of violence that people recognize it has cost for democracy. So I think it's pretty widely accepted, not a controversial point. Violence against women in politics is different from political violence in a number of very important ways. So first, it's identity-based. It's not necessarily about what you believe politically, but it's about who you are. So women are specifically targeted by this form of violence, and it's driven by this patriarchal imperative that men are the only valid and legitimate political actors. The forms that it can take can be gender differentiated, for example, with sexual violence, but it can also be things like assassination, which is about removing women from those public spaces. And I argue in my book that the democratic costs of this form of violence are not yet widely recognized, but it is a form of violence that deeply affects the political process in very, very deep and important ways. And so it's really important to sort of recognize that this is a form of violence that's been normalized largely. It's not been spoken about, but it really does affect the integrity of our political processes. So this is just to clarify that it doesn't include all forms of violence faced by politically active women. So there are some forms of violence that are clearly politically motivated. For example, we could think about the of Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Although her murder has never been officially solved, all of the potential suspects were attacking her on political grounds for policy differences. On the other hand, you have other cases which are clearly, riven through with sexism and misogyny, clear cases of violence against women in politics. So we could think about the impeachment of Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff in this sort of category. But then there are other cases where it's actually both of those things are sort of come together. I think a good example is the Swedish climate activist Greta Tinberg, who, as a way of sort of attacking her political ideas, opponents often talk about her identity, right? So she's young, she's female, she's autistic, right? As a way of sort of delegitimizing her political ideas, right? Through these identity-based attacks, right? So you can kind of see that both of these things are at work in the same moment, same case. I still think it's important to think about those two different parts separately as well. All right, so then how do we figure out if something is identity-based? In my book and also my joint work with Juliana Restrepo-Sanin, we draw on a hate crimes framework, which is really about trying to detect bias as a factor driving a particular event. Although we don't think about this just in terms of legal crimes, but thinking about incidents of bias. And so some of these things are things that the perpetrator said or did while committing the attack that would suggest that it was, in this case, gender motivated. So comments, statements, symbols that they use. But I think what's really helpful is especially like the fifth criteria, which was about the substantial portion of the community where the event occurred perceived that the incident was motivated by bias. So a good example here is the murder of Jo Cox, the British MP in 2016. So a week before the Brexit referendum, she was killed by white nationalists. So people said this was sort of politically motivated violence, but the response of women in parliament to this event was that it was very much an attack on women in the public space. And so they really felt that this was something that involved misogyny. And they spoke up about it, and the results, the result of this was also that many women decided not to run for political office again, right? So this is a way that we kind of sort of look to see where bias might be playing a role. To the standard hate crimes framework, we also add this 6 criteria to kind of capture ideas of implicit bias. Times when maybe gender trope isn't used, but we could see a double standard where women are attacked in a way that men might not be. An example might be the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, who was charged with corruption, but actually her male predecessors had done the exact same thing and had never been impeached. And most of the parliamentarians who were driving her impeachment process were themselves under investigation for corruption and other forms of ethics violations, right? So it really wasn't so much about her corruption. It was really as a way of sort of hiding some of the gender motivated component as well. Okay, so then what does it look like? So most practitioners who work on this really focus on 4 types of violence, which come from the international frameworks on violence against women. So we see physical, psychological, and sexual violence. They appear in the 1993 UN Declaration for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And economic violence is added by the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention in 2011. And so this was a study that I assisted the Interparliamentary Union in doing. And I think what's really interesting about this graphic, and I think maybe can't quite see because of the pictures of people here, but if you look at physical violence, it's about 25% of the women who were interviewed for this study, parliamentarians all around the world, all different backgrounds, government, opposition parties, et cetera. About 25% of them said they personally experienced physical violence in the course of their work in parliament. That was only one of the forms of violence they faced. You can see at the left that psychological violence, more than 80% of them said they experienced some form of psychological violence. About a third said they experienced economic violence, and about a fifth said they experienced sexual violence. So clearly just focusing on that one form, right, really doesn't kind of capture the bigger set of experiences of women who are active in politics. I also find it very interesting is that the survey asked if people had personally experienced or if they'd seen their female colleagues experience this form of violence. And psychological, physical, economic, there's really sort of relatively similar numbers, right? Very similar. But if you look at sexual violence, it's a pretty big difference. And, one of the reasons to ask this question, have you witnessed against other women, is that sometimes women would be kind of embarrassed or ashamed to share that they'd been a victim of violence. But sometimes they'll put their own experiences, like if you ask if their friends or their neighbors experienced it, right? They put their experiences in that category as a way of telling you that, but without admitting it, that it was them. And so you can see with this difference with sexual violence, I think really tells us that sexual violence is still the most stigmatized and difficult for women to speak up about, but clearly very, very prevalent. And this was prior to Me Too. I think that a lot more women would probably say that they'd experienced it now after Me Too. So in my book, I talk about these 4 forms of violence. I think physical violence is probably not very, people understand what this is. Here's just an example of Juana Quispe, who was a local indigenous local counselor in Bolivia, who was killed in connection with her political work. Psychological violence takes lots of different forms, but the most common or most discussed is online abuse. So being attacked through Twitter, for example, in particular, as a way of really getting you to leave Twitter, right? And so work on this finds that it does seem to affect women across the political spectrum, but women of color tend to receive a disproportionate share of these types of attacks. There was a study I just read the other day, which looked at abuse of politicians in the United States. They found that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the most abused politician on Twitter, and Ilhan Omar was on Facebook, right? And so I think that really tells us a lot about this, that it's also sexual violence has been a topic that's received more and more attention the last few years, especially after Me Too. A number of parliaments, women in different political spaces start to talk about their experiences with sexual violence. The last 2 weeks has been a huge issue in Australia in the wake of some allegations of a cabinet minister having raped a political staffer in his office. The 4th type, economic violence, I think is less well known or understood, but it's about using economic means of coercion, right, and intimidation. So for example, damaging a woman's campaign materials, graffitiing her office, right, burning down her house, her fields. These are all things that make it very difficult to continue in politics because it's just not viable to stay in that space. An example I have here of the Iraqi elections was women's campaign materials were so vandalized that, specifically vandalized that the UN Special Representative for Iraq actually held a press conference together with political parties to say, this is something that is really a huge problem and a big challenge to women's full and equal participation in the elections. So to these, I add a 5th type of violence, which is not quite, I think, captured by those traditional 4 forms, and I call it semiotic violence. So semiotic violence is about the use of words and images to degrade and delegitimize women as political actors. So for example, through sexualized image, sexual objectification more broadly, which is really about sort of saying, reducing ideas about women's competence in political spaces, right? We also see that it's a huge part of what people are starting to call gender disinformation. So for example, deepfake videos, photoshopped images of women in sexually compromised position, alleged sex tapes, right, which don't actually feature the woman in question. And it's about, sometimes these things are sent to the women who are portrayed, but it's actually not really the main point of these forms of violence. It's about delegitimizing these women and women in general before the eyes of the larger public. And it's about sending a message to women who might think about getting involved in politics that this is what you're going to face if you enter these spaces. So it makes it very difficult for women to continue to succeed and to thrive in political office. And this is a form of violence that we haven't really articulated very well. And I feel like it's a really important part of that broader continuum of violence. Okay, so then what do we do about this? And I felt this is a really important part of this project. So in each of the book's chapters on, for example, physical violence, I included solutions to physical violence that have been developed around the world. So I did it for those 5 types of violence. And I also have a chapter about cross-cutting solutions, so solutions that cover multiple forms of violence at the same time. But I've organized these together here to some forms of sort of different levels of interventions, just to give you a flavor of what these potential solutions look like. So first is awareness raising. That was like in every single chapter of the book. And so one example of this is the National Democratic Institute's Not the Cost campaign, which Hannah mentioned I've been involved with for the last 5 years. Next week, we're going to have a new event renewing a call to action on the 5-year anniversary of the Not the Cost campaign. And the slogan, Not the Cost, is really a rejoinder to those who would say, violence is just the cost of doing politics for women. And so the campaign is to say, actually, it shouldn't be the cost of women's political participation. And it's really about trying to denormalize this as something that we should accept, right, against politicians, but against women because they're women, right? That if you're there, you just deserve to be abused because you're a public figure. And we're like, why would we accept that, right? We should sort of denormalize this. So Not the Cost is an important slogan here. But you also see women sort of doing this individually. In California, a group of women who were legislators, staff, consultants, lobbyists, journalists came together to denounce sexual violence in California politics. We also see individual women giving public talks, publishing books to really call out this violence and to say, share their experiences and to really highlight this is something we shouldn't accept as part of being a woman in a political space. We also see a growing number of global and state-led initiatives. So I mentioned the UN General Assembly resolution. There's also the recent ILO Convention 190, which has some components in it, which really help us think about, could be applied to thinking about politics as a place of work. So these are areas we could sort of explore more. We also see a growing number of state-led initiatives, especially in Latin America, to pass legal reforms to criminalize political violence and harassment against women. In 2012, Bolivia became the first country in the world to do this, but a growing number of Latin American countries have either revised parts of their violence against women legislation, or they've proposed new standalone laws to deal with this issue. To the extent that the Organization of American States held some consultations to help develop a model law. So this idea of let's use all the lessons learned to help design more effective legal interventions. We also see a number of parliament-led solutions. For example, after Joe Cox was murdered in 2016, the British Parliament set up a specialist police team to investigate threats against parliamentarians. And at the time, about 30% of parliamentarians were women, but they were receiving somewhere between 60 and 70% of all these threats. So clearly it was something that was disproportionately affecting women, to the point that they even appointed a female police officer in a special office to be able to really work, serve as a liaison to make sure that women MPs were safe. They also found that this was something that disproportionately affected MPs of ethnic minority backgrounds as well. I would say the bulk of interventions, though, are from civil society. So some examples here include a website set up by women in the British Labour Party to collect women's testimonies of violence inside the party. It was very difficult to explore violence inside of political parties, but some of the emerging research suggests that the main perpetrators of violence against women in politics tend to be members of women's own political parties, as well as their own relatives. And that sounds strange at the beginning, but then if you think about it, well, violence against women, most women are harmed by people who are close to them, people that they know. So we would expect the same to be true here as well. But inside parties, it's much harder to also talk about these issues because it's about making the party look bad, right, in front of, could be harming its electoral chances. And so we're seeing that currently, right, with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and the sexual harassment allegations against him. We also see some other interesting interventions like Parody Bot, which is a bot that tries to counteract abuse and attacks on women in politics during elections, which sends out positive tweets whenever it detects negative use of tweets against women running in those elections. They've used this in Canadian, US, and New Zealand elections the last couple of years. We also see some, very basic interventions to support women's safety. NZI has a think 10 tool, which is about safety planning. And in Kenya, the Federation of Women Lawyers called FIDA Kenya created an SMS hotline where women could report incidents of electoral violence, but also could get legal aid, referrals to healthcare to deal with these attacks as well. And finally, we see a number of individual-led efforts, right? Individual women just coming out and saying, I just need to share my experiences. I need to denormalize these and to say that this isn't okay. And in the United States, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a really important face of this issue. She's called out this problem on the floor of Congress, like she did last summer when she was disparaged by one of her Republican colleagues. She does it often on Twitter, like all the time, calling out people who attack her, and sort of trying to sort of say, I don't accept this, or I'm not going to be silent about this abuse. In her recent Vanity Fair interview too, she talked a lot about how the volume of threats were so bad that I didn't even know if I was going to live to my next term, really to give us a sense of what it was like to experience this. But she also reflects on this, and I think she's almost like an original theorizer of violence against women in politics too, because she says, those experiences were really dehumanizing, but the idea, the whole point of these threats is to get you to destroy yourself so that they don't have to destroy you. And so she says it's not an accident, right? That the boogeyman of every electoral cycle of the Democrats is a woman. It was, Pelosi, it was Clinton, and now it's me. At the end of last year, she actually joined together with 4 other Democratic women colleagues, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Jackie Spear, to put forward this House resolution on recognizing violence against women in politics as a global phenomenon, including in the United States. They emphasize that several times through the House resolution. It's not just a problem out there, but it's also a problem for the United States political system as well. So before I sign off, I'll just let you know, Hannah mentioned this as well. So the book isn't really meant to be like the final word on violence against women in politics. It's really about trying to sort of help foster a global conversation around these issues. So to keep up with those debates, I created a Twitter account that shares new news, research, events that are happening around violence against women in politics. I also created a website that includes like a whole catalog of all the academic and practitioner work that's been coming out on this issue. Like every week I'm adding new pieces to that. We're really getting a lot more focus on this problem in a global sense, both by academics and by different global and regional organizations. And finally, I'll just let you know, if you're interested in the book, at the bottom of this form, which Oxford University Press gave me, there's a code you can use on the OUP website where you can get a discount on the book if you're interested. So thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about my book.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your remarks. And I'd now like to invite anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question to do so. You can just go down to the participants tab and hit the blue raise hand icon, and then I can unmute you from there. Conversely, if you are having any issues with your audio or you just prefer it, you'd be welcome to type a question into the chat. Yeah, Hannah.
I'm just thinking while people formulate their thoughts, I was hoping I could just lead off with one reflection that I'm sure you've thought a lot about, and I would just love to, I personally love our community to hear you think aloud about focusing this on women as opposed to gender. And how do we think about this? These intersectional perspectives are so important to recognize right now. And I think we obviously have this kind of growing recognition that in terms of vulnerable or people's or vulnerable gender categories or status linked gender categories, women are not the only category, right? And also that being perceived as gender non-conforming, whether you're a man or a woman, makes you more vulnerable to gender-based violence and harassment. And so I think there's still so much work to do on women that I would never want to, undervalue the importance of the work you're doing. But I would love to hear you again, just kind of articulate and think out loud for our community about how do you think about the trade-off of making it just about women as opposed to gender inequality more broadly.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And in some other presentations I've given, people often ask about, what about the LGBTQ community, right? So how do they fit in this discussion? And I think it's such an important part of the discussion, especially as you mentioned, through intersectionality. So we know that women from ethnic minority groups tend to be more targeted. We also know that younger women are more likely to be targeted. Women from lower castes, for example, it was an Indian study that showed that they were more targeted for these types of attacks. But we don't know as much about, for example, lesbian or trans politicians or activists. But some of the some examples, like Angela Eagle, who's running for the British Labour Party leadership, she was attacked both as a woman and because she was the first open lesbian in Parliament, and so it's like homophobic attacks were sort of mixed in with this sexism and misogyny. But one of the things I try to do in my book is to sort of think about this as like identity based in a way that we could potentially like expand it to thinking about not only women, or to be able to think about it as intersectional abuse. But I think there's a second part of your question, which is like the violence against women component. So this is part of like the interviews I did with many practitioners, which was, do we call it political violence against women? Do we call it political gender-based violence? Do we call it violence against women? And it was like, which thing do you center? Electoral violence against women. And one of the kind of common answers I found was that there was this concern, if you called it like electoral violence against women, it would be like using the electoral violence frameworks and then just sort of adding women into those. And those electoral violence frameworks tend to be more narrow, as I mentioned. And so the idea was that if we call it violence against women, we're bringing like a feminist, we're sort of centering violence against women and all the understandings and concepts from that space and bringing it into politics, right? And so that's sort of where people kind of ended up there, to sort of call it violence against women, sort of bringing in this broader understanding of violence that attacks women because they're women. But I think there's so much more like research and theorizing that could be done specifically on the LGBTQ community gender nonconforming people, because I think they would also very much face these identity-based attacks. And hoping that's, one of those frontiers we'll see more of in the future.
Thanks. Erica, I saw that your hand was raised earlier. Do you have a question or no? Maybe? Okay, great. Give me one sec. Let's see.
Hi, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was jumping the queue because there are a lot of questions in the chat. So
yeah, I'm trying to just build up a synopsis of them. So go right ahead.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this really terrific presentation. It's super interesting and very important. And thanks for posting the information about the resources too. I'm actually really interested in hearing how you'd respond to the issue that Mayor Soros has brought up earlier in the chat, just about the degree to which like explicitly naming the issue or drawing attention to it either elicits more blowback or greater kind of visibility of violence or actually helps to kind of mobilize effective responses to it. And just your reactions to that. I mean, based on everything we know about backlash, sort of what are some generally effective ways to name it and to make sure that those who name it aren't then further victimized down the line?
That was, I think, a really important consideration as I was working on this this project. So in the very first chapter, I talk about how if this is a problem that's existed for a long time, what has stopped women from speaking up about it? And so I talked about a number of different gaps. So one of them is like is a cognitive gap where some women just don't see themselves, right? Like they just don't see maybe sex discrimination or don't see themselves maybe as victims of violence, or they wouldn't call it violence, right? So there's some women who just don't see that. And what's really fascinating is that most of the women who have been vocal on this issue tend to be more on like the left side of the political spectrum, right, than on the right side. So conservative women, I think, have been much more hesitant to speak up about it. And so I think there's something about that, like their ideology and their sort of view of the world, that makes it hard for them to speak up about it. But then there's also, partisan gap where they don't want their party to look bad, or they don't want themselves to be seen as a not viable candidate, somebody who can't hack it in the world of politics, right? So sometimes they know it's a problem, they just don't speak up about it. But I also say that there's a receptivity gap, which is this idea that like you would speak out, but then people try to humiliate you for that reason, right? And so, or they don't believe you, right? So like women have this sort of testimonial problem where people don't believe what they say. And so, Julia Gillard talks about this in her book, where like she called out sexism, misogyny in Australian politics. People were like, oh, it's not sexism, it's just you, and you're playing the gender card, and this is like a fake problem. Obviously, we've seen this with Meghan Markle over the last week too. And so, the response of a lot of these women was like, it just got to the point where, they just felt like they had to do it. But it's interesting when they start to speak up about it, it's often after they've left politics. So they feel like there's an interesting dimension here. There's still, I think, a hesitancy to talk about it. But there's also this, I think, awareness of some of the other women that when they do talk about it, could this potentially demobilize other women who want to run for office? A lot of studies are showing that young women saying that they're not as interested in running for office anymore. And also, learning that it's going to be a hard slog means women are like, I'm just not going to bother with this. But I think where a lot of those politicians come out, and I think where I come out here, is that, I think it's so important to talk about the issue, right? Because if women, for example, go into politics not knowing about this, then it's like they start to individualize the problem as themselves. They don't see it as a structural problem. And I think that, we best approach things the more prepared we are for what's going to happen. So kind of bookend the book by thinking about that issue also at the very end as well. And I'll just end with a quote that a friend of mine shared about a Colombian human rights defender who said, I'm going to be attacked for this anyways, so I might as well just speak out, right? Like it's just like, if I don't speak out, I'm going to be killed. If I do speak out, I'm going to be killed. So I'm just going to do it anyways. And I think that is really, I think, speaks to the bravery, right, of trying to break the silence on this problem.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, the chat is popping off. And there was one that sort of came at the start, and then I've heard someone echo a variation on it. And the question begins from Angela, which is, what's the best way to combat violence against women in politics? And then I found an interesting follow-up from Anne, speaking for personal experience and then continuing it, who says, in my small town in Maine, we're experiencing a lot of violence against 3 of our women school board members, including herself. We have little success in affecting change and having town leadership take this abuse seriously. Do you have any recommendations on other next steps? We've gone to the media, however, the story did not focus on structural issues. So it sounds like in Anne's question, there's a few possible ways to rectify this in response to the original question of best ways to combat it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that this is like the ongoing question. And it was interesting when I worked with the National Democratic Institute on Not the Cost campaign. 2016, we had a whole list of possible actions. They were all hypothetical. And I recently updated the call, and I was like, wow, people have done a lot of these plus more, right? So there have been lots of efforts to tackle this problem for the last 5 years, but we don't really have a sense yet of what's the most effective. But one of the common arguments I get or questions I get is about legal. Is it really about is the legal avenue the best way to go, like we see in Latin America? My personal feeling is that I think at this point, one of the most important things to do is, again, just naming the problem, and highlighting that it's not acceptable. It's just, I mean, so much of this is the work of trying to make people aware of this problem. The observation about school board members is really interesting, because one of the other sort of emerging findings is that women at the local level of politics seem to experience this at a much higher rate, because with local politics, right, it's in the community. People know who you are. They know where you work, where you go to school. Often local council meetings, local offices are freely accessible to the general public, right? If you're someone who's a cabinet minister or parliamentarian, there's a whole other security structure to help you. And so it's, I think, one of these areas that we haven't really figured out the best way to do this at the local level. And part of, I think, the example here about going to the media, I think, is really interesting, because that seems to be that sort of awareness raising strategy, but it doesn't always completely sort of break the way, right? There's still challenges to get people to understand that this is a serious issue, and it's it's harming the democratic process at this very tangible local level. I do know some cases of going through the legal system and others, but that depends on knowing perpetrators and things like that. And I think we don't always know who these perpetrators are. Sometimes these are anonymous threats, people who hide behind that veil in order to be able to perpetrate these types of acts.
Thank you so much. That's great. All right, so I'm trying to think of what I've already heard you speak on and what other questions I've seen in the chat. And one of them is kind of an interesting take from where you were talking about in terms of getting people to take it seriously in the media and other avenues. And someone asked a question on public policy that I think bounces off that quite well. Harshita asked the question, which is, how much of a public policy issue is sexual violence? And what I think she's meaning, and how she says it is, in terms of public policy serving as a solution. So how does public policy affect it? Does good public policy solve it? Does weak public policy lead to increased violence? Or is there any sort of feedback loop between policy on violence against women and violence against politicized violence against women?
Okay, I think there's a few different strands in here. So some forms of public policy are capable of dealing with this issue. For example, we see in a number of countries when we're able to bring perpetrators to court, for example, because of online abuse, will undermine some sort of legal protection against, intimidation online. Sometimes, things like stalking or whatever. These things are in many places are already illegal, so you can kind of like slot it into those existing legal protections. But it's we still don't know, right, how effective this is, because it's such a new issue. So we don't know, if this is making more women feel like they have avenues to address these forms of attacks. But I think what I've learned is that a lot of the work is sort of outside of the public policy realm. For example, some conversations I've had recently about the role of like Facebook and Twitter, right, in making sure that people are safe online. So in the last U.S. election, Facebook introduced the whole Public Figures Project to help people who are running for office be more protected and more safe online. So, there's some of these things where it's not just like the policy is like a company policy, right? It's not necessarily just public policy as well.
Great, thank you so much. And Eglantina, did I see that you had raised your hand as well? Okay, give me 1 second, I'll unmute you. It'll say the host has asked you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you so much, Professor Krook. I'm a member of parliament in Albania, but also in Council of Europe. Recently, we made a report on enhancing women participation from underrepresented groups. And we'll launch it very soon. And one of the factors that kept women from entering in politics, it is in fact violence against women in politics, hate speech, and really the images, sexist images that are used towards them. And this is really a strong factor from the interviews that I made, really. And also myself, from my experience, this is very true. So I highly appreciate the book that you prepared and discussing this issue. Is there anything, I listened carefully that you said that probably changing the laws might be a step forward, but not only the laws can bring the change. Are there any other ways we can address it as women parliamentarians, as women in politics ourselves? Besides probably the awareness raising, how we could be together in order to really combat that? And if there are any good practices from different countries that we could also widespread or use or refer to? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, so I this was so important in the book to for me to try to figure out some of these emerging solutions. So what so there's like a lot more detail in the book, and some of these also appear on my website. But just to give you some examples of women in Parliament, for example, there's been some movement towards pushing for codes of conduct that would be both at like in Parliament about what's acceptable and not acceptable, and people, for example, on sexual harassment, like I will not like sexually harass my colleagues or my staff, but also inside their own political parties. For example, in Mexico, that's been a big push to create these protocols. So codes of conduct, public inquiries. This has been very effective, for example, in the UK, to like publicly commission studies that will, in hearings that will collect people's testimonies and give a sense of the problem, and also how people who experience it feel what needs to be done or where the holes in existing policies. And the last one I give is online solidarity. One of the really interesting things, I mean, obviously hashtags work here, but, when women who are being, completely facing a barrage of death threats and rape threats, it's the, expressing solidarity with other women to sort of help them, cat pictures and other things like this, right? Like to sort of positive discourse and trying to revert that. So I think this is an issue where like really everybody can do something. And I really want to sort of emphasize the importance of that we can all sort of play our role, like where we are in the space that and the tools that we have, we can do something to try to support women's, because this is about just protecting a right that women already have, right? Their equal, free, full right to participate in politics.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your question. All right, and I see Angela has her hand raised. Angela, if you're able to turn a camera on, that would be great, just so that we can see you. And I'm asking you to unmute now.
Sure. I wanted to ask a question about, given Harvard's recent news about gender discrimination in the department, do government departments teach a culture that continues violence against women in politics?
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring this up, right? Because obviously all spaces are, it's not just politics, but political science, the study of politics. And I think this is where I started with the political violence of literature, right? That you have a very narrow idea about what violence is and where it can take place. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to adopt a very broad definition of who a woman in politics is. So women who are active in any part of political activity or the political sphere. So I talk about, activists, party members, political staffers, campaign volunteers, right? Like all these, but we could also think about, political journalists, or people who study politics as well. And I think that this is really important about, to recognize this as a form of like harassment, hostility that quells women's voices in these different kinds of political spaces. So I think it's very, potentially consistent with some of the ideas that I've been talking about here. There's so much more I could say about this topic, but maybe I'll just close that there.
Great. Thanks so much. It's one of the questions that I saw come in that sort of follows up on what you were just sharing is on the sort of like, okay, what's the brass tacks impact on this? And it was a question that Claire raised in the chat, which was, do we know whether women actually refrain from seeking public office because of disproportionate violence?
Yes, I think this is such an important question, and one that I've tried to emphasize in my work too. We're not just talking about like the women who are in politics now. We're also talking about the political pipeline. And Eglantine mentioned this with like women who are running for office. Like why wouldn't they run, right? They mentioned this is something that they have thought about. But we see, for example, some of the research on political staffers finds that for example, okay, so there was a young women's organization in Canada that did a study of young women in Canadian politics, and they found that of these women who'd experienced sexual violence in the course of their political participation, 80% had either left politics or decreased their political involvement as a result of that sexual violence, right? So they were campaign volunteers, they were interns. And so these are exactly the type of women who you would expect to potentially think about a political career in the future. The Interparliamentary Union did a study of staffers and parliamentarians and found that staffers were, it was like over half of them had experienced some form of sexual harassment or sexual violence. And these are exactly the people who would run for office in the future as well. We also see that there was some evidence from the latest British elections where a very large share of women who were incumbents decided not to run for re-election. They just said this abuse is just not worth it. It's not worth it, right? I don't want a political career this much that it is worth putting up with this type of behavior, right? So it's getting women out of the pipeline, coming in, but also the women who were there leaving as well. You know, so I think it's something that is a very big challenge beyond just those who are directly impacted here at the moment. So I think, you know, near the end of the book, I talk about it as a violence against women in politics is a problem to democracy, right? Who participates, but also what do we lose by those people not being able to participate in politics? It's a violation of human rights, right? We all have the UN Declaration on Human Rights is that we all have the right to, you know, to safety, the right to, you know, freedom of expression, right? All of these types of freedom of association, all these things are undercut by violence against women in politics. And then finally, it's a threat to gender equality, right? Women cannot be full and equal participants in politics and in society if they face all these forms of gender-based violence. So we really need to really focus on this issue to make sure that we can make, you know, life better for women, but also for society more broadly.
Professor Krook, thank you so much. Thank you for your important work that has obviously scholarly important, but work that is also important to practice. And I love your vision of a framework that is a work in progress to enable thinking and practice. And there's so many of us who hope to plug in. And I would, just as one additional extension, I would highlight that our Professor Nancy Gibbs is the head of our Shorenstein Center of Press and Politics, often surfaces very similar dynamics with journalists, female journalists who are attempting to, as you say, you know, advance the purposes of democracy. So this is a topic with profound implications, and continuing our exploration of intersectional perspectives on these questions of gender politics. I very much hope you all will join us next week in our seminar. We're going to be featuring Dr. Brown from Purdue University, who's going to be discussing Sister Style, the politics and appearance for Black women political elites. So please join me in thanking Professor Krook, and please join us again next week.